going to do today is compare it to perfect competition. So see, economists believe perfect competition is like the best model. We'll see why they think that, and then compare what happens to monopolistic competition, and which we think is better for the real world. Then we'll get into oligopoly, talk about that market. That'll be a really quick chapter. We're skipping like over half of the chapter. You're basically just getting the overview because they get into like some details that are a little too in depth for what we need to do here. So we talked about how perfectly competitive firms and those perfectly competitive markets achieve productive and allocative efficiency. The concept from like the very beginning that we just kind of touched on. Basic idea, productive efficiency, you're producing these items at the lowest possible cost. So you remember the perfect competition, like little graph of the firm. In the long run, they're producing where the average total cost curve is at its minimum. That's where there's that zero economic profit. There's also allocative efficiency. And perfectly competitive firms produce all goods up to where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So in this case, where the marginal revenue that the firm receives equals the marginal cost of production. And not just are they going to be producing at that quantity, but they're going to be charging the marginal cost at that price. Remember, because the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the price were all that same horizontal line in a perfectly competitive market. On the other hand, the monopolistically competitive market that we've been looking at, we don't have a graph there, okay, does not result in either productive efficiency or allocated efficiency. So we said like this is the goal, this is like what's so awesome about markets, this will take us to this place, but most markets in the real world don't end up actually reaching there. So there's like a debate among economists, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Because monopolistically competitive markets do have pretty good benefits for consumers, but it has this cost that it's not as efficient as possible. So here's our perfectly competitive market, or I guess a firm in a perfectly competitive market. A horizontal demand curve is the marginal revenue and equals the price. Our marginal cost curve, so we're going to produce at the quantity where marginal revenue curve and marginal cost curve intersect. In the long run equilibrium, there's zero economic profit because any firm is earning a profit while competitors enter their industry. That's the minimum point of the average total cost curve. So it's both allocatively efficient and it's productively efficient because we're both producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and selling at that price. So we're selling at like the lowest possible price, and we're minimizing the cost at which we're producing. The average total cost is as low as possible in this market. So consumers get goods as cheaply as possible, and they get goods, or I guess only the goods that the marginal benefit is equal to or greater than the marginal cost for them. On the right side, we have now a monopolistically competitive market. So kind of like the monopoly, we have the downward sloping demand curve. Firms are able to set their own price. They can choose a higher price or lower price to sell more or less of a good. And we end up with a marginal revenue curve that's downward sloping and below that demand curve. These monopolistically competitive firms are going to choose to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's their profit maximizing quantity. But they're going to price above that. Remember, they're going to trace that up where that quantity hits the demand curve. That's going to be the price. So it's not productively efficient. I'm sorry, allocatively efficient, because they're not pricing it where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. They're pricing above that. Also, that's the point where the average total cost curve here hits the demand curve. Again, we're in equilibrium, so there's zero long-run profit because new firms can enter the market and begin competing again. If we minimize the average total cost curve to be here, where it crosses marginal cost curve, just like we saw here. By definition, the marginal cost curve will cross the average total cost curve, remember, at the minimum point. That is the productively efficient level of output. That's where we minimize the average total cost. So we're producing where the average total cost of production is higher than the minimum. So if they would produce a greater level of output, monopolistically competitive market, they would produce at a lower cost. So it's not as efficient as possible in that respect. Also, they're charging a price above the marginal cost. So consumers aren't getting these goods and services for the lowest possible price. That's why we say fails to achieve productive and allocative efficiency. If those definitions get too much, just think they're charging a higher price than the cost, and they're not producing at the lowest possible cost. And one of the effects is we're not producing enough of the product. Here it's called excess capacity. So they have the ability to produce this many goods at the minimum possible cost of that productive efficiency, but they're only producing this number right here, this quantity. So they're not producing enough. They could produce more if they wanted to and do it cheaper. But because that's not where they're going to maximize their profit, they're not going to produce there. So this would suggest that monopolistic competition is not a good situation for consumers. That consumers are being made worse off because we're not reaching either of these two types of efficiency. But there's other ways that consumers can benefit from a monopolistically competitive market. They get product differentiation. Not every consumer has the same wants and needs. So, because of that, if you have a monopolistically competitive firm that somehow differentiates their product, has some different characteristics that all the other firms in the industry doesn't have, some consumers are being made a lot better off. Even though they're paying a slightly higher price than they would if all the goods were exactly the same, they're getting some sort of benefit, some characteristic that meets their needs better. So there's a sort of trade-off there. Paying a slightly higher price, but they're getting something that's made better for them. So if you were buying a car, think of this example. Would you prefer one that was sold the lowest possible price, but there was only one car out there? So everyone had to deal with the same, I'm trying to think of that car from the Soviet Union. Was it the Opel? I don't remember. Like in the Soviet Union, they had like one type of car basically. And like if you wanted to buy one as a consumer, like basically that was it. You got it at the lowest possible cost. And it was produced, at the minimum point on the average total cost curve. They're minimizing the cost of production. But if you had a bigger family, you're SOL. You got that car with, 4 or 5 seats, that's it. If you want like a sports car, something that can go fast, too bad. You don't have that choice, but you get it as cheap as possible. Or would you prefer a car produced and sold at a higher cost, but it's designed specifically for you? It's everything that you want in a car. So it meets your needs perfectly. For most people, it'd be B. They'd say, I want something that meets my needs perfectly, even if I have to pay a little bit of extra money for it. Because in that case, it's worth it for you. So in most markets, consumers are willing and very happy to accept paying a higher price for a product that actually meets their needs, or meets it better than a perfectly competitive market where all the goods are exactly the same. So it's not necessarily bad for consumers. Yeah, just to highlight the difference between these two graphs again. The key difference in these two types of markets that we're looking at is that the demand curve slopes down for marginal cost. Remember, it's because of this differentiation, because these goods are different, that the demand curve is going to be sloping downward. That gives them the ability to price it, to choose what price they want instead of passively accepting the market price. So of course they have the choice to make, like how do we price it? Do we try to lower the price and sell more, or do we try to increase the price and sell fewer but get more revenue per whatever we're selling? And remember, because these firms have differentiation in a monopolistically competitive market, they have like a small monopoly over their product because they're the only one that sells it. So some are going to be willing to buy at a higher price. So if they increase the price, some people will go to their competitors, but a lot of the consumers are still going to purchase from them. And again, even though we don't have this productive and allocative efficiency, we're selling at a higher price and we're not producing at the lowest possible cost, consumers still get the benefit of this differentiation. They get these different types of goods that are able to meet their needs better. The textbook does include some of this information in a section, but I don't think they mention just how important this choice is. So we talk about the goal of the economy being to allocate scarce resources to their highest valued uses. Kind of a boring way to think about it, definitely a sort of a technocratic way to imagine one person pulling all the levers deciding what resources go where, rather than seeing the economy as a bottom-up system where individuals, firms, consumers, workers, they try to figure out what's best for them and do what's best for them. What firms want to do is try to find out what people's needs are and then figure out a way to meet them and do it, as cheaply as possible so they can make a nice little profit for doing so. And because there's scarcity, remember, consumers have to choose among all these different alternatives. So we have to figure out what goods are the most valuable for us, what meets our needs the best, and firms try to do the same thing. All right, what do consumers want? What is going to meet their needs the best so they can earn the highest possible profit? With monopolistic competition, we see this type of competition really taking place. In a perfectly competitive market, competition is just lowering the price so that you're producing at the lowest point in the average total cost curve. In a monopolistic competition, you're constantly trying to come up with new products or differentiate yourself somehow. Our example from last class, Chipotle differentiated themselves amongst other fast food restaurants by basically creating their own new category of food, the fast casual, or slightly higher quality than you would get at a typical fast food restaurant. They were also incredibly customizable. They took the Subway model and just used fresh, better food, or better ingredients to make it. So by doing that, they were able to stand out. Eventually, other firms began competing against them, offering very similar products. So what they did is they tried to cast their business in a different light, that they were more ethical, more responsible than other firms. Compared to McDonald's or Taco Bell just selling you the pink slime, and they're selling you locally sourced, organic meats and vegetables. So some people complain about 47 different breakfast cereals being offered in grocery stores, that there's too much choice. Bernie Sanders said that a while, I think it was in 2016, primary. He mentioned too much choice being a problem. Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, has said, pretty much echoed that sentiment. But I don't think that's the case, because what that shows is there's 47 different types of consumer out there, consumers that want different things from cereals. So firms that figure out a way to meet those needs in some capacity. If restaurants were perfectly competitive, so they're all offering the same exact food, people with interesting food taste or weird food taste wouldn't have an opportunity to get the food that satisfies them, that they enjoy. If they are perfectly competitive, so let's say in this region, there's no chance for, probably no chance for Chinese food, but no Ethiopian food, Indian food, different cultures that would not be represented around here by the typical resident. So you wouldn't see that type of food around here. So if that was something you liked, something you enjoyed, you wouldn't be able to get that if we had perfectly competitive restaurant industry. So it's competition. Even though in monopolistically competitive markets, prices aren't as low as possible. We're not producing the lowest possible cost. We're still getting this differentiation that we wouldn't be able to get in the other market. Okay, let's briefly talk about marketing to end this chapter. So one of the things that firms want to do is make consumers believe that their product is worth buying, that it actually does meet their needs. And it's different from other firms. They somehow stand out on at least one margin. So typically they'll need to do some sort of marketing for that. It's not just enough to have your product out there and have people buy it and talk about it amongst themselves. You need some sort of advertising, some sort of, you need to be putting information out there so that consumers understand the product that you're selling. So economists, in like their typical fashion of being very broad and vague about something outside of the field, call marketing all the activities necessary for a firm to sell a product to a consumer. So all the typical things that you wouldn't talk about in an economics class. One of the really good things about marketing is that it's, in a way, it's explaining to consumers what the product is and what it can actually do for them. In a more negative light, it's almost like trying to trick them into buying it. I won't quite go that far, but some people who are skeptical of marketing or don't like marketing see it as less than honest. But it can be very useful just to let consumers know, the information about the good you're selling, explaining how it's different from other firms' goods, explaining what it actually does, especially if it's like something new. You want to tell consumers how this is actually going to meet their needs. So once a firm in a monopolistically competitive market somehow differentiates their product, it has to continue to do so. They can't just sit back and rest. Think of Chipotle from that example. At first they differentiate their product. They offer something completely different. Then a bunch of other firms being competing, offering something very similar. So that chips away at their economic profit, starts reducing it as we move towards the long run. So they have to continue to somehow show that they're different. Either keep innovating and changing the good, or engage in what's called brand management. So brand management can include this innovative process. It can also include just simple marketing to show off that good or convince consumers that it's different. So advertising, very important part of a monopolistically competitive firm that's trying to compete in this market. Because again, you want to show to consumers that what you're selling is different. And it's not just the same as everything else. You're somehow meeting a different need that others can't meet. That's what gets you that sort of mini monopoly over your specific brand. You're the only ones that can meet some specific need. So firms advertise effectively. They do a good job explaining to consumers what the product is and inspiring them that this is how you can meet this need, that this is going to make your life better. They can increase the demand for their product. If they do use advertising to differentiate a product, if they're successful at doing that, they can make the demand curve more inelastic. Basically, they're reducing the number of substitutes because they're showing, hey, you can only get this thing from us. That's basically what firms want to be able to do. If your demand curve is more inelastic, that means you can increase the price and you're not going to lose as many consumers. So you can earn a greater profit in the short run. Remember, in the long run, your profits are going to be eaten away by new competitors offering the same sort of product that you're offering. So some consider advertising wasteful and even dishonest, especially if you're more skeptical of businesses. I think most people tend to be skeptical, so I mostly talk about how awesome businesses are. Try to move you guys more towards an accurate perception. Hell, like half your other classes, you'll probably hear about all the bad things business do. So this is more about inspiration about some of the good things they do, the role they actually serve in society. One of the good things about advertising is it reduces information asymmetry. So it gives people more knowledge about these products that they are considering buying. The more you know about something ahead of time, the more likely you are to make a better choice. Very straightforward, very hopefully intuitive idea. But I still think it's very important to mention that advertising can give people an idea of
what the good is specifically, and then, you know, what it can provide versus other goods. And then it can spread the product to new people. So people who haven't heard about it yet, first time they see an advertisement, that firm has opened themselves up to a new market, a new group of people that had not seen it before. So it helps them increase their sales that way and expand their market. Any of you guys heard of the car company Packard? Very old company. They made cars back in like the 40s and 50s. Well, Vance Packard, the guy who was in charge of it, was very upset when the company went bankrupt. He blamed the advertising executives. He said it was advertising, the Mad Men, like from the show Mad Men on Madison Avenue, New York City, that were the ad executives. They were, helping out GM and Ford, and they were being too dishonest, and they were convincing people to buy all their cars at the expense of Packard. So he wrote a book called Hidden Persuaders, all about the power of advertising and about how they'll persuade people to buy things they wouldn't have bought otherwise. Now, this book sold extremely well. People like all across the country bought it. They thought it was very interesting, and advertising was, becoming bigger and bigger and more sophisticated. It was less, hey, this is what I'm selling and these are the details about it, and more like, you should buy this so you can be an awesome person, live an awesome life. The old Ralph Lauren ads from like the 80s and 90s, showing people in like super nice clothes and like country estates, the sort of like aspirational idea, hey, I want to live an awesome life like that, versus, hey, this is the shirt, this is how long the collar points are, this is how long the shirt actually goes. Like I said, less information, more psychology got involved, especially after World War II. Well, Packard was friends with a lot of the people that worked on Madison Avenue, so he thought that they were all going to hate him afterwards. He was so upset he didn't care. He was still going to write the book, but he thought he was going to lose a lot of friendships over it. Well, it turned out that they loved it. They thought this book was the greatest thing in the world. It was the best advertisement for them. People and like firms that had never like engaged in this sort of advertising before were now going to them, willing to pay them a lot of money to create these like a whole marketing plan for their company, because they think, hey, like apparently this really affects people. One of the things that makes me think advertising isn't quite as effective as most people believe, and as definitely people believe because of Packard's book, is the fact that firms tend to spend such a small portion of their budget on advertising. If it was really that effective, you'd think they would spend even more to increase their sales. Despite that, it's still very important to protect the brand name and to show consumers that just, hey, not only do we have this product out there that you should buy, it meets a specific need. It can do the specific thing for you that other companies can't. Develop and encourage that mini monopoly you have over the specific product. So the brand name helps maintain that differentiation, prevents your profits from being competed away in the long run. So you get to keep some of that, even as other firms begin competing against you and offering something similar to you. I keep going back to the White Claw example because I think it's such a good example of monopolistic competition. Even though there's a lot of other hard seltzers out there, White Claw is like the first one most people think of. They've done a good job protecting their brand name. Even just coming out with like new flavors has kept like their name in the news, and people say, oh, I'll try these new flavors. So when many people think of hard seltzers, that's the first one they think of. So it's made it more difficult for other firms to come in and compete away their profits. You're much more likely to think of White Claw than you are to think of like the Corona seltzers. There's some firms that are so highly successful with developing their brand name, like Coke, Xerox, Band-Aid, probably Zoom at this point, that when you think of that product, even that generic product, you use that brand name. Well, the Kleenex is another one. That there's a lot of people, I think it's less common in the North, but people in the country that when they say they want a soda, they'll just call it a Coke. no matter like what brand they're talking about. That these firms have developed such a good brand name that when people think of that product, they only think of that brand. They only use that brand name. Another important thing is to make sure that other firms don't illegally use your brand name. They're usually protected by trademarks, so that other people can't use that brand name or something very similar to the brand name or the logo, to trick people into buying this other product. And last one is franchisees. So you are able, you spend a certain amount of money, you're able to open up a franchise of a specific brand. McDonald's has done a really good job of making sure that each one of their locations sticks to the McDonald's system as well as possible. So if you go to like any McDonald's, you're gonna get the same quality. Not that it's the highest quality, but you know exactly what you're gonna get every time you go there. You don't have to deal with the inconsistency. Okay, and we're gonna skip this little last section about what makes a firm successful. Differentiating their product and actually meeting consumer needs and advertising it well so consumers know that. That's what makes them successful. You guys have any questions about monopolistic competition before we move on? Like I said, for the exam, you are not going to have to recreate this for me. Too many curves going on here to get too confused. But you should know how to do this and say, like, right here, this is a profit. Or if they're competing and there's no long-run profit, be able to show that. Again, 4 curves we're dealing with here. Demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, and average total cost. So make sure you do know that for the final. There will be a question about that on there, or using that. All right, so we'll quickly go through the last type of market structure called oligopoly. Oligopoly is different from the other 3 that we've done so far, which is why I saved it for last. There are no cost curves involved in this chapter. So monopolistic competition was the last one you're going to have to remember. So perfect competition, monopolistic competition, I just highlighted the difference. This is through like the beginning of class. But they are, pretty similar, especially compared to monopoly and oligopoly. So in an oligopoly, there's a small number of firms. They're all independent, so they're not like all part of one company. So they're making different decisions and they're competing against each other. But there's only a couple of them. So we're not going to be able to use the cost curves like we have so far to understand what's going on and how they compete against each other. Because there's only a small number of firms, they're very large, and they know that when one decides to cut their prices, or one decides to produce more, that's going to have a very strong effect on the other one. So they're going to have to respond to what each other are doing. And because there's barriers to entry, so like a monopoly, it's very difficult to begin competing. It's not impossible, like in a monopoly, but it's very difficult. Firms aren't going to enter to compete away the profits. So profits are going to persist in the long run. Without being like monopolistically competitive firm that figure out a new way to differentiate their product, to keep going with the profit. In this case, once they have it, it's going to persist for a long time. So one tool to figure out if a market is a oligopoly or not is called the 4-firm concentration ratio. That's just the fraction of an industry sales that are accounted for by the 4 largest firms. So the Census Bureau does this every 5 years for industry, like breaks it down by industry. And they figure out, okay, how much of the sales of this industry are just come from the top 4 firms. If it's very high, the typical number is 40%, but if it's very high, they say, okay, this is an oligopoly. There's not a lot of competition. If it's a low number, they say, all right, there is a lot of competition. It's monopolistically competitive or something else. Unfortunately, 4-firm concentration ratios, they're very simple, very easy to look at, and because of that, they're not exactly the most accurate tool. A very quick, easy way to figure out if it may or may not be a monopoly, but the odds are you're going to need a little bit more. Okay, yeah, I'll wait on the weaknesses. So here's a couple examples of oligopoly. So discount department stores, like Walmart and Target, the four-firm concentration ratio is 97%. Pretty safe to say that's an oligopoly. There's only a couple of firms. So if Walmart does something, Target's going to have to respond to it. It's going to really affect them. Monopolistically competitive market, a firm may see a chance to profit when someone else differentiates their product. They may say, hey, this is a consumer need that we could also try to meet. And they can jump in, but they don't have to. In an oligopoly, Walmart does something, Target has to respond to it. It's going to really strongly affect them because there's so few competitors. The cigarette industry, like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, full firm concentration ratio, 98%. There's only a couple big tobacco manufacturers anymore. Yeah, there we go, bookstores is what, 75%. So college bookstores like Barnes & Noble, Olette, I don't know what that is. 75% of industry sales come from the largest four firms. So again, four firm concentration ratio, a good look at an industry, but there are problems to it. So the three problems: they don't include goods and services from foreign firms that they export to the US. We're only looking at US firms in this case. So there could be other firms from other countries. So like, look at the auto industry. There's only a few firms in the US, but there's a lot of different car companies overseas that also import cars to the US. So it's not taking into account competition from those firms. They're also calculated for national markets, even if the market is truly local. So, like college bookstore market, you may say, okay, like its four firm concentration ratio, 75%, a lot less than the discount, like Walmart and Target. But if you're at St. Francis, you basically have the bookstore here and Amazon. You only have two choices. So there may actually be less competition in this market, even if there's a lot of firms across the country. Or it could be the opposite situation, where it's like, I don't know, like grocery stores. Say there's like 2 or 3 giant grocery stores across the country, but you also have some local ones competing. So you may have only 2 of the big national chains in the area, but you could have like 4 or 5 different mom and pop shops that end up competing. So you have a decent amount of choices to go to. Full firm concentration ratio kind of covers that up because we're only looking nationally. And the last one is the definition of the market is tricky. For, I think it was like price elasticity of demand, we talked about how narrowly or broadly you define the market determines like how elastic the demand is for that good. The same kind of thing here, where how narrowly or broadly you choose to define the market has an effect on whether there's an oligopoly or not. So if you define it really narrowly, you say Walmart is in like the discount department store thing, they're competing against like Target. Well, Kmart doesn't really exist anymore. But they used to compete against Kmart. And then BJ's is in like a slightly different market, but there's a lot of overlap. Does anyone know what BJ's is? Oh, wholesale club. Okay, so it's like Sam's Club. So there is a decent amount of competition between those two. There's some overlap between what they offer. But they're not in the same exact market. So we like broaden the idea of the market, then we have more competitors. It's not just Walmart and Target. You've now got Sam's Club, Costco, BJ. So there's a larger number of competitors. You could say the NFL has a monopoly on pro football. That's assuming The Rock doesn't get the XFL back off the ground after COVID. You say they have a monopoly. They're the only one offering professional football that you can watch. But if you expand the market a little bit to pro sports, okay, you've got the NHL, you got the MLB, NBA. You've got other choices if you want to watch professional sports. You broaden that market even further, say, well, it's just entertainment. So you're brought into the whole entertainment market. And you're looking at movies, you're looking at TV shows, you're looking at like concerts. You can really expand market. So you can go from the NFL being, a monopolist to the NFL being like a monopolistically competitive firm if you expand the definition of the market enough. There's a similar thing to the four-firm concentration ratio, which is the Herfindahl index, about like how many, like the sales revenue for like the largest firms. That's I won't really go into details about it, but that's something from The Office. And when Michael goes to business school, they ask him what the Herfindahl index was, and he like thinks the guy's trying to mess with him. It's like a made-up word. Did you know it is actually a real thing? So the reason oligopolies exist is because there's some sort of barrier to entry. So something makes it difficult for new firms to enter this industry. So even if there's economic profits there, they're going to persist because you can't jump in and just start competing against them. The biggest example is economies of scale. We tend to see large economies of scale in oligopolies. So you end up with a few firms being able to minimize their average total cost at a high level of production. So they're producing a ton of whatever good. So there's only room for a couple firms in there. So it can be very difficult for new firms to enter a market because there's really high fixed cost. Like the auto industry. The average total cost tends to be minimized at a very high level of production. So you end up with a few large firms. When the auto industry started, there were hundreds or thousands of automakers in the US. They came from all different industries before that. But very quickly, they all started to get bought up because of the high fixed cost of this industry. So it's very difficult for a new firm to begin competing. Tesla got a ton of subsidies from the government and a ton of investments from people that like the idea of green energy in order for them to be able to start competing and selling cars. But without absent all of that, it would have been very difficult for them to get in and start competing. Here's a very basic kind of simple idea. You don't need to like memorize this. This is something to help you intuitively grasp this. The long-run average cost curve for a firm in a competitive industry. And here's the long-run average cost curve for an oligopoly. See, the oligopoly has economies of scale. They minimize the average total cost way out here. Whereas a competitive firm has economies of scale right there. They minimize the average total cost right there. If, let's say both of these markets are like the same size, the demand curve is way out here, we'll probably get, what, 2, maybe 3 oligopolists that are able to compete in this market. Anyone else is going to produce too few, your average total cost is going to be too high, and they're going to get competed out of the market. These big firms will charge a much lower price because they're able to, they can produce more efficiently, drive them out of business. In a competitive industry, you would see the quantities down here, equilibrium can be somewhere out there, so you can have a bunch of them competing, all producing their minimum average total cost. So naturally, there's only really enough room for a couple firms in an oligopoly market, whereas there's room for a lot more firms in a competitive market. That's not the only reason. You can have the ownership of a key input. So we talked about Alcoa before for monopoly. You can have the same thing for an oligopoly. So after they basically lost their monopoly, remember they had like all the bauxite in the world. Now it's down to just like most of it. So there's a few other like firms that are able to compete against them. Very small number though. De Beers Diamonds, Ocean Spray, same thing. They have the control of most of the resources in the industry. So very few firms can compete against them. So if you're a firm that has access to most of the resources, there's only enough room for 1 or 2 more competitors against you. So that's another reason why you could have an oligopoly. They're more rare and typically involve natural resources. Ocean Spray, I don't know how they did that with the cranberries. I don't know the history behind them. But at one point, they had like direct control of like 95% of cranberries being grown. Basically, they had like deals with all the farmers that grew cranberries. And the last one is some sort of government-imposed restriction. So the government could grant exclusive rights in an industry to one or a small number of firms. Not very common, especially like in the US today, but it's still a possibility. So there's things like patents, where they say, okay, you're the only firm that can produce this good for a while. Encourages research and development because you get this high level of profits for a while. but then eventually it becomes public domain. And it's, kind of tricky to set the patent timeline, like the right length of time, to encourage as much research and development as possible in some of these industries, like pharmaceuticals, while also at the same time encouraging low prices for consumers. Another example is occupational licensing. The government restricts entry into professions by setting different requirements in order to get in. So you have to pass, go through a certain educational program. You have to do a certain amount of on-the-job training, pass exams, pay fees, have good moral character, be 18, speak English for a lot of these. Ton of different requirements that are set up. Not too many in the business world. Mostly it's in things like healthcare and then other services where it's difficult to tell quality ahead of time. But what they do, they limit entry into the profession by between 14% and 27%. 14% was one of Kleiner's estimates. 27 was Blair and Chong a couple years ago. And what that does is increase wages for people within the profession. So, something the textbook uses as an example of oligopoly, actually two separate oligopolies, is Atlantic City, New Jersey. Atlantic City, New Jersey was a very popular destination for people in the Northeast who wanted to go to the beach. It was close enough to like New York and New England that it was like a decent drive to get there. I mean, this is way back, like 30s and 40s. But it was far enough south that you had warm enough water to really enjoy it in the summer, not like going to a New England beach. All the street names in Monopoly, the board game, come from Atlantic City, New Jersey, because it was such a destination. Once airfare became cheaper, people from the Northeast, especially people that had money, would just fly down south to Florida, to the Caribbean, and they would go to those beaches down there, better than Atlantic City. So Atlantic City kind of hollowed out. They lost a lot of the hotel industry kind of crumbled, because they had this natural barrier to entry, that they didn't have a lot of competitors up in the Northeast that could combine proximity to people that wanted to go on vacation, and also a good beach atmosphere. Because of the airline industry, they lost that. They fell in hard times for a while. But then, in the 1970s, New Jersey passed, I don't think it was a law, I think it was actually passed by voters, like an initiative, to allow gambling in Atlantic City. You had gambling in Vegas. You didn't have anything in the Northeast at the time. So again, they had another oligopoly. In this case, government restrictions on entry. You couldn't open up casinos elsewhere in the Northeast. Because of that, again, they became a gambling hotspot. This government restriction on entry and all these neighboring states not allowing competitors. So they were basically one of the only ones. But by 2014, a lot of neighboring states allowed gambling. So you can go to casinos in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware. I'm assuming New York too, but I don't remember if it was them for a fact or not. With this, Atlantic City struggled again. Their profitability fell substantially because they didn't have these government barriers to entry around them. A lot of the casinos went bankrupt. Famously, one that opened in 2012. They spent $4.2 billion opening, trying to make a top of the line, super fancy place. Enough states had just opened up that was a terrible idea, and they went bankrupt within 2 years. So we're not going to be able to use the the curves that we worked with the past three industries. So we'll use game theory. Game theory is a study about how people make decisions when they're having to deal with other people. So the other person's, what you think the other person is going to do weighs upon your decision. So it involves human interaction. It's becoming more and more popular in economics and in the field called behavioral economics, which is kind of like a combination of psychology and economics. I'm just going to briefly touch on it here so we can figure out how oligopolies compete against each other. But it was developed by Oscar Morgenstern and John von Neumann back in the 1940s. You know, like super smart, like mathematicians that like started this. And it does have some uses for us even here. So basically what game theory is going to be is we're going to basically explore two individuals, two firms, whatever, playing a game. So there's going to be rules that the game abides by. There's going to be strategies that the players employ to try to get, to try to win. And then there's going to be a payoff at the end. So that's the result of these interactions. A lot of times when economists or behavioral economists do game theory, they bring in a few people into like, I don't know, a lab. They explain the rules of the game, and they have them play against each other. What we're going to do is just kind of imagine it. Imagine competition between two firms. But we can model this based off the payoffs. So these firms will develop strategies based on what they think their payoff is going to be. So if we're looking at firm production, we're looking at oligopolist. The rules of the game are going to be their production function, the market demand curve. The strategies are going to be their actual production decisions, how much they should produce. And the payoff is going to be the profits. We're going to move the slides around. All right, this is called a prisoner's dilemma game. We're going to walk through first of a duopoly, and then I'll show you an actual prisoner's dilemma. So let's suppose there's two firms that are competing in the streaming service industry. We have Spotify here in what's supposed to be blue, and Apple up here in red. So these, like the left corner right here, is Spotify's payout, or the profit they're going to earn. And then Apple's is these kind of reddish ones on the right, their payout or the profit they earn. So if you imagine you're Apple, and you're trying to figure out how you want to price your services. Your goal from this is, earn the highest profit possible, given what Spotify is going to choose to do. So the actions you're going to choose are your business strategy. Now in this case, Apple and Spotify have two choices. Obviously you have like a million different pricing choices, but they're trying to decide between two prices. $9.99 and $14.99 for a month of your streaming service. So if they both choose to sell for $14.99 a month, they both earn $10 million in profit. If they both choose to sell for $9.99, they earn $7.5 million in profit. So they earn a lower profit by selling at a lower price. If one of them chooses to sell for $14.99 and the other chooses to sell for $9.99, the one who sells the higher price is going to get $5 million in profits. The one who sells at the lower price will earn $15 million in profits. Again, more people flock to them because they're selling basically the same thing at a lower price. So if you're Apple, you have to look and think, okay, what are Spotify's two choices? Sell for $14.99 or $9.99? Given their choice, if they choose $14.99, which pricing choice will make me better off? If they choose $9.99, which will make me better off? If there's one of those pricing choices that makes you better off for both of their choices, that's what you're going to pick as a firm. Luckily, for a very simple prisoner's dilemma like this, that's what's going to happen. All right, well, I guess let's start by supposing you're Spotify. Apple can choose $14.99 or $9.99 price. Let's say Apple chooses $14.99. They choose this. If Spotify sells for $15, they'll earn $10 million in profit. If Spotify, I'm sorry, 15. If they do the $9.99 or $10, they'll earn $15 million in profit. So they earn a higher profit if they sell at $9.99 if Apple chooses the higher price. If Apple chooses the lower price, $9.99, Spotify will earn $5 million profit selling at $14.99 at a higher price, or they'll earn
7.5 million in profit, selling at the lower price. So these circles are trying to give away the answer. If Apple chooses $14.99, they have a higher profit selling at $9.99. If Apple chooses $9.99, they also make a higher profit selling at $9.99. So that's their dominant strategy in this case. Selling at $9.99 is going to be the best for Spotify, because whichever price Apple chooses to sell at, Spotify will have a higher profit by selling at this lower price. Now assuming we're Apple. If Spotify chooses the price of $14.99, Apple can also sell at $14.99 and earn a $10 million profit. Or they could sell at $9.99 and earn a $15 million profit. They prefer to sell at $9.99, the lower price gives them a higher profit. If Spotify chooses $9.99, Apple chooses $14.99, they earn a $5 million profit. They choose the low price at $9.99, they earn a $7.5 million profit. The higher one is at $9.99 again. So we have the same thing here for Apple. They're going to choose the lower price, the $9.99, because no matter what Spotify chooses the price at, Apple will earn a higher profit by selling the lower price. So it's also Apple's dominant strategy. Now what this tells us is that we would expect both of them to charge $9.99. We're going to expect Apple to, and we're going to expect Spotify to. So they're both going to earn a $7.5 million profit in this case. We call both firms charging $9.95, so the bottom right-hand corner, a Nash equilibrium. So that's a firm choosing the best payout for them based on the choice by the other firm. There was a movie years ago, because Russell Crowe was like young and thin then, about John Nash, where he plays him. I would like to show that clip because he explains Nash equilibrium when he's at a bar with a bunch of his friends. Unfortunately, they don't explain it properly. So if you try to watch that clip to get like an intuitive idea, you're going to get a slightly wrong definition. So it's not going to be worth it. I think it's on the next slide that explains that. Yes, so both firms will tend to choose the price of $9.99, make a $7.5 million profit piece. But notice, they both could make a $10 million profit. They both choose to sell at $14.99. If they could somehow collude, somehow convince each other, or somehow reach an agreement that they're going to sell at that higher price, they could both earn a higher profit. Now in the US, collusion is illegal. But businesses can't get together and agree on strategies. Definitely a good thing for consumers in this case, but too bad for the firms, right? I'm not crying, but they're probably upset about that. The reason why they can't just come to it, I guess, intuitively without discussing it or reaching an agreement is that, let's say Spotify and Apple are both selling at $14.99. So they're both earning a $10 million profit. Then Apple says, well, the hell with this, I can sell even more if I lower the price. So they drop the price to $9.99. Spotify goes from earning $10 million to $5 million in profit. Apple increases their profit from $10 million to $15 million. Apple knows, and Spotify knows, if they're both selling at $15 or $14.99 initially, if they drop their price, they can increase their profits. Both of them are going to be encouraged to do that. And again, because no matter where their opponent, their competitor price is at, they're going to make a greater profit at that lower price. So that even in cases where firms would be able to collude, they're going to be encouraged to break that agreement. And we tend to see that when cartels do form, they break apart very quickly because each member is encouraged to cheat. Each one is encouraged to sell a lower price or greater profit. So in this case, this Nash equilibrium is what's called a non-cooperative equilibrium. Instead of cooperating together,
and both of them earning that high profit, they're going to end up competing against each other. They'll pursue their own self-interest to maximize their personal profit. If we allowed both firms to coordinate their actions, they could reach exclusive agreements. We'd be looking at what's called a cooperative equilibrium. In that case, the players cooperate together to increase their payout. So for social interactions, like when you're dealing with friends or like family members, cooperative equilibrium would make sense. But when firms are competing against each other, they're just going to try to maximize their profit. So we'll end up with these non-cooperative equilibriums, which again is good for consumers because they're getting these goods at a lower price. This game is a version of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. And that was the first example that they came up with when looking at this game. It has the same kind of payouts as we saw with the Apple and Spotify in this case. In a prisoner's dilemma, both individuals pursuing their dominant strategy, the best strategy for them, is going to end up with a non-cooperative equilibrium that leaves them both worse off. The first idea of this, like a thought experiment, was two individuals both accused of a crime. They're partners together in this crime, and they're both guilty. They get hauled in by police and put in different interrogation rooms. The police say, okay, if you confess, we'll give you a lighter sentence and your partner in crime a greater sentence. If both of them keeps their mouth shut, they'll have a small jail sentence. There's not enough evidence to convict them. If one of them confesses, let's say they have no jail time, they'll get like a little bit of probation, the other will have a large sentence. And if they both confess on each other, they'll both go to jail for a pretty decent amount of time. The dominant strategy for each of these individuals is to confess. Unfortunately for them, they end up going to jail for a long time because they both confessed on each other. Now, this doesn't always hold, this prisoner's dilemma, because prisoners aren't just trying to maximize their time in jail. They do have previous history with each other. They may have reason to trust each other or to distrust each other. If they have reason to trust each other, it turns the non-cooperative equilibrium into a cooperative equilibrium. They can trust the other person will not confess on them, then they'll not confess on their partner in crime, and they'll have a very short jail sentence. Now, the Spotify and Apple competing against each other, or even the prisoner's dilemma in a lot of real-world examples, is what's called it's like a repeated game, where there's repeated interactions between both sides rather than a one-shot game. The example we walked through was just a one-shot game with Apple and Spotify. They play once, they make one decision, they get one payout, that's it. If you play repeatedly over and over again, you can tacitly come to an agreement without actually reaching an agreement together. You can behave as if you've come to an agreement. One thing you do is what's called an enforcement mechanism. The easiest enforcement mechanism was called tit for tat, whereas like you both start out selling at the higher price. If one defects and charges a lower price, takes some of your profit, for themselves, increases theirs, then you defect the next period. There's other ways. There's some which is just like I forget what it's called, but it's like a hard switch, where if someone defects once, then you just defect every time the rest of the time. So you can punish, these are ways to punish a competing firm for selling a lower price. One thing they do in the real world is a price match guarantee. So they'll say like, hey, we will match or beat any of our competitors' prices. That's a way to show them, hey, I'm charging a higher price. If you go and decide to sell at a lower price, I'll be doing the same thing. There's a way for them to act like they're colluding to sell at that higher price. There's another form called price leadership, where one firm, the oligopoly, typically like the largest, the most powerful, announces a price change publicly. They say, we're going to do this. And then the other firms in the industry follow them. Auto industry is the best example of oligopoly. So back in the 70s, we saw GM would do that. GM would announce a price change at the beginning of when they rolled out like the new cars for that model year, and then Ford and Chrysler would match them. All right, that is the end of oligopoly, which is perfect because it's like right about the end of class. You guys have any questions for oligopoly? When I do the review, we're going to go through game theory again, go through the not the prisoner's dilemma, but the duopoly game version. You can understand how firms are making these decisions.